There's a thin, gray line that separates the hunter from the hunted. For Officer Miller, that line was the rain-slicked asphalt of a forgotten industrial district, shimmering under the strobing red and blue lights of his patrol car. He had been hunting this ghost for 6 months. Leo, a name whispered with fear in the city's underworld. A man who moved like smoke, leaving a trail of violence and broken lives in his wake. He wasn't just a criminal. He was a force of nature, a whirlwind of desperate rage. And tonight, for the first time, the ghost had made a mistake. The chase was a blur of screeching tires and shattering glass. It ended here, in a dead-end alley that smelled of rust and damp concrete. Leo, cornered, finally turned to fight. He was not a man who surrendered. He was a cornered animal, all teeth and fury. The struggle was brutal. It was primal. There was no clean Hollywood arrest. There was only the grunting, gasping reality of two men trying to break each other under a torrential downpour. Miller was a good cop, experienced and strong, but Leo fought with the terrifying strength of someone with absolutely nothing to lose. It ended with Miller's knee on Leo's back, his face pressed against the wet, gritty pavement, the cold steel of handcuffs clicking shut around his wrists. Miller was breathing heavily, his body screaming with pain, a fresh cut above his eye. He had won. The ghost was caught. He hauled Leo to his feet. And this is where the story should have followed the script. The insults, the rough shove into the back of the car, the satisfaction of a hunter who has finally caged his beast. But Miller did something strange. He looked at Leo, really looked at him. He didn't see a monster. He saw a young man, barely out of his 20s, his eyes burning with a hatred so pure and so absolute, it was almost beautiful in its intensity. He saw a soul that had been set on fire a long, long time ago. Leo spat at his feet. "Go to hell," he hissed, his voice a low growl. Miller didn't flinch. He didn't react. He just stood there for a moment in the rain, looking at the man he had just risked his life to capture. Then he reached out, not with aggression, but with a quiet, steady hand. He gently wiped a smear of mud and blood from Leo's cheek with his thumb. "You're already there, son. The question is whether you want to stay there," Miller said quietly, almost sadly. Leo stared at him, his burning hatred momentarily replaced by a look of pure, utter confusion. This wasn't part of the script. The kindness, the gentle touch, the sad paternal tone from the man who had just beaten him into submission, it was more disorienting than any punch. It was a language he didn't understand. And in his world, anything you don't understand is a trick, a weakness, an insult. This small, unexpected act of humanity didn't plant a seed of hope in Leo's heart. It planted the seed of a very specific and very deadly obsession. The trial was a formality. The evidence against Leo was a mountain, and the walls of a maximum security prison rose up to claim the next 20 years of his life. For the city, the story was over. The monster was caged. For Miller, it was just the beginning. He couldn't shake the image of the young man in the alley, the burning eyes, the momentary flash of confusion. Most cops, after an arrest like that, would move on, celebrate the victory, file the paperwork, and forget the face. But Miller was different. He saw not just a crime, but the wreckage of the human being who committed it. He started digging, not as a cop, but as a man. He pulled Leo's juvenile records, talked to his overwhelmed foster parents, to the teachers who barely remembered a quiet, angry kid in the back of the classroom. He pieced together a story not of a monster, but of a boy who had been thrown away by the world long before he ever threw a punch. A boy passed from one broken home to another, a ghost in the system, invisible until he finally made himself seen through violence. Meanwhile, Leo's world shrank to the size of a concrete box. Prison didn't rehabilitate him. It validated him. It was a world that made sense. Here, the rules were simple. The strong survived, the weak were devoured. Kindness was a myth. Hope was a disease. And his hatred, the only thing that had ever truly been his, found a target. It wasn't a faceless system he hated anymore. It was a specific man, Officer Miller. The memory of that night in the alley festered in his mind. That moment of unexpected kindness wasn't a memory of hope. It was a memory of humiliation. To Leo, it was the ultimate act of condescension. The cop hadn't just beaten him, he had pitied him. He had looked at him like a broken thing that needed fixing. And Leo was not broken, he was forged. He was a weapon. That gentle touch, that sad voice, it was an insult that burned harder than any punch or kick. He fed his obsession in the darkness of his cell. He worked out, his muscles hardening into armor. He studied the faces of the other inmates, learning the art of silent, brutal survival. And every night, he would close his eyes and see Miller's face. He nurtured his hatred like a rare, precious flower, watering it with the memory of that one unforgivable act of grace. Miller, on the other hand, was fighting a different kind of battle. He would occasionally visit Leo in prison, in the early years. He would sit on the other side of the reinforced glass, trying to talk to him. Not about the crime, about the future, about a life that could still be lived. "You're smarter than this, Leo," Miller would say, his voice calm and steady. "This doesn't have to be the end of your story." Leo would just stare at him, his eyes cold and dead, a wall of pure silent hatred. He never said a word. The visits were a waste of time. Eventually, Miller stopped coming. But he didn't stop trying. He started writing letters, not to Leo, but to the parole board, to the warden. He wrote about Leo's childhood, about the system that had failed him. He argued that the man inside was not beyond saving, that 20 years in a cage would only sharpen the weapon, not disarm it. He was fighting for a second chance for the man who hated him most in the world. He was planting a seed in a garden he would never get to see, unaware that the man he was trying to save was spending every waking moment dreaming of how he was going to burn it all to the ground. 20 years is a lifetime. It's long enough for a city to change its face, for technology to leap into science fiction, for hair to turn gray at the temples. For Officer Miller, it was 20 years of a good, quiet life. He had risen through the ranks, becoming a respected detective. He had married, raised a daughter, and was now just a few short years from a well-deserved retirement. The fire of his youth had cooled into a steady, warm ember. He was a good man, a good cop, a good father. The ghost of Leo, the angry young man in the alley, had faded. He was just a memory now, a file in a cold case drawer of his mind, a reminder of a battle he had fought and, in his own way, lost. He had tried to reach the man and failed. He had accepted it. He had moved on. For Leo, 20 years was a sharpening stone. He walked out of the prison gates a different man than the one who had walked in. He was bigger, harder, colder. The fiery, chaotic rage of his youth had been forged in the crucible of prison into a single, perfectly honed blade of purpose. He didn't blink at the sunlight. He didn't marvel at the change to world. He saw it all through a gray, deadened filter. He was a ghost of a different kind now, a man out of time, with only one thing connecting him to the present, one goal that had been his northern star in 2 decades of darkness. His obsession, Miller. He had spent years planning. He had learned the cop's name. He had followed his career from behind bars, reading old newspapers, listening to prison gossip. He knew Miller was a detective now. He knew he had a family. He knew where he lived. This wasn't a crime of passion anymore. This was a pilgrimage, the final necessary act to close the circle, to reclaim the power that had been taken from him in that rainy alley. He didn't see it as revenge for the arrest. He saw it as an act of purification.
He was going to erase the one person in the world who had ever looked at him with pity. He was going to prove, once and for all, that he was not a broken thing to be fixed. He was a force to be reckoned with. Miller was coming home from a late shift. It was a quiet, peaceful night in his suburban neighborhood. The houses were dark, the world was asleep. He parked his car in the driveway, the familiar crunch of gravel under the tires a comforting sound. He was tired. He was thinking about a cup of tea, about kissing his sleeping wife, about the comfortable silence of his home. He didn't notice the figure that detached itself from the deep shadows of the oak tree across the street. He didn't hear the silent footsteps that fell on the soft grass of his lawn. He got out of the car, his briefcase in one hand, his keys in the other, and a voice from the darkness spoke his name. Detective Miller. Miller froze. It wasn't the voice of a neighbor. It was a voice he hadn't heard in 20 years, but one his soul had never forgotten. It was deeper now, colder, but it was the same. He turned slowly, and the ghost from his past stepped into the pale moonlight. It was Leo. His face was a hard and motionless mask. His eyes were the same, cold, dead and burning with a hatred that had not dimmed, but instead had been perfectly preserved in the vacuum of time. Miller's mind raced. His hand instinctively moved towards the place on his hip where his service weapon would normally be, but he was off duty. He was unarmed. "Leo," Miller said, his voice steady, betraying none of the shock that was coursing through him. "What are you doing here?" Leo took another step closer. "I came to finish our conversation, the one we started in the rain. You told me I was in hell? You were right." And he raised his hand, and there was a gun in it. "And I've come back to return the favor."
The sirens wailed, closer now, a sound that was once a promise of order, but was now just a soundtrack to his profound emptiness. Leo didn't run. Where would he go? His life's single burning purpose was complete. Extinguished on a quiet suburban lawn, he had hunted his ghost, and now he was the one who was truly haunted. He dropped the gun. The metallic clatter on the asphalt was the only sound in the sudden silence. He raised his hands as the first patrol car screeched to a halt, its headlights pinning him in their accusatory glare. The arrest was a silent, mechanical ballet. There was no struggle, no rage, none of the feral defiance of 20 years ago. He was a machine that had completed its function and powered down. The other cops, their faces a mixture of cold fury and grief for their fallen brother, treated him with a detached, professional brutality. He was no longer a man to them. He was a package, evidence, a cop killer. The hours that followed were a blur of sterile white rooms and the low, monotonous hum of fluorescent lights. He sat in an interrogation room, the silence broken only by the quiet fury of the detectives who came and went. They didn't ask many questions. What was there to ask? They just wanted to look at him, to try and comprehend the man who had murdered one of their own, one of the good ones. Leo said nothing. He stared at the scuffed surface of the metal table, his mind a gray, silent fog. The victory he had craved for 2 decades was ashes in his mouth. He had expected to feel power, release, vindication. Instead, he felt hollow. The fire of his hatred, which had kept him warm in the cold prison nights, was gone. And in its place, there was just a vast Arctic emptiness. Killing the man hadn't filled the void inside him. It had just made it infinite. During the long, quiet hours in a holding cell, a memory surfaced, unbidden. A memory of one of Miller's visits to the prison, years ago. The cop was on the other side of the glass, his face looking tired, older. "It doesn't have to be like this, Leo," Miller had said, his voice calm, reasonable. "People can change. I've seen it. You've paid your debt for what you did. You could have a life." Leo just stared back, his silence a wall of contempt. A life.
What did this cop with his neat house and his happy family know about a life like his? It was the ultimate insult, the pity of a man who stood on high ground looking down. Now, sitting in the silence, another thought occurred to him for the very first time. What if it wasn't pity? What if it was something else? He pushed the thought away. It was a weakness, a crack in the foundation of his hatred. Miller was the enemy. He put him in a cage. He looked down on him. It was simple. It had to be simple. The next morning, a young, nervous public defender was assigned to his case. The kid looked barely old enough to shave. He sat across from Leo, a thick, worn file folder between them on the table. "Look," the lawyer said, his voice trembling slightly. "There's not much to say. They have you, cold. This is just a formality." He slid the folder across the table. "These are from your original case file. The state requires that you have access to all documentation. It's your history." Leo glanced at the folder, uninterested. History. His history was written in scars and steel, not on paper. He was about to shove it back, but a small, stapled packet of documents on top caught his eye. It was different from the official court papers. It was a series of letters, correspondence, between Detective Miller and the state parole board.
Leo stared at the name, Miller. His first instinct was a surge of the old, familiar hatred. Of course, the cop was probably building a case against his parole from the very beginning, writing letters to make sure the monster stayed in his cage forever. It was proof that Miller's visits, his words about a second chance, were all a lie, a hypocritical game played by a self-righteous man. He felt a grim, cold satisfaction. He had been right all along. The man was a fraud, and he had delivered the perfect, final judgment. He opened the packet, his fingers surprisingly steady. He was ready to read the words of condemnation, the official arguments detailing why he was a lost cause, a danger to society. He was ready to see his own hateful worldview confirmed in the neat typed letters of his greatest enemy. He read the first letter. It was dated 5 years into his sentence. It was a formal petition, written by Miller, addressed to the warden. It wasn't a letter of condemnation. It was a request to have Leo transferred to a different facility, one with a vocational training program. Quote, "Inmate 734 shows a high aptitude for logical problem solving. While his social skills are non-existent, his mind is sharp. Allowing him to learn a trade like mechanics or carpentry would provide a constructive outlet and a potential path forward upon his release. Keeping him in a general population yard with no purpose will only sharpen the anger that put him there." Leo stopped reading. He felt a strange, jarring sensation in his chest. It wasn't what he had expected. He quickly flipped to the next letter, dated 3 years later. This one was to the parole board. It was an argument against a decision they had made to add 2 years to Leo's sentence after a prison fight. Quote, "While I do not condone inmate 734's use of violence, the incident report clearly states he was defending another, weaker inmate from a gang beating. This was not an act of random aggression. It was a misguided but fundamentally protective instinct. To punish this act with more time is to punish the very flicker of humanity we should be trying to encourage." Leo's breath caught in his throat. He remembered that fight. He hadn't been protecting anyone. He had just been establishing his own territory, proving that he was not to be trifled with. Miller had seen the report, and in his mind he had twisted a brutal act of self-preservation into a sign of moral character. He had seen something that wasn't even there. He read another letter, and another. They were all the same. A quiet, persistent 20-year-long campaign. Miller arguing for him to get access to the prison library. Miller petitioning for him to be considered for a reduced sentence based on good behavior. Miller, the man Leo saw as his jailer, was secretly acting as his advocate, his unseen, unknown defender. He was fighting for him all this time. The foundation of his hatred, the solid bedrock upon which he had built his entire identity for 2 decades, began to crack. The simple, clean story of a hypocritical cop and the righteous anger of his victim was becoming a complex, muddy, and unbearable mess. The world wasn't simple anymore. It was tilting on its axis. He slammed the folder shut, a wave of confusion and a terrifying, unfamiliar emotion washing over him. He didn't want this. He didn't want complexity. He wanted the simplicity of his hate. It was a trick. It was all a game, a way to control me. But the words felt hollow. They were the desperate, dying gasps of a belief system that had just been dealt a mortal blow. The letters were not a game. They were the patient, thankless work of a man who looked at a monster and had stubbornly, foolishly insisted on seeing a man. He needed to know more. He needed to find the final piece, the one that would either confirm his old hatred or shatter it completely. He turned to the last document in the packet. It wasn't a letter. It was a copy of an official, legal motion, heavily stamped and signed. A formal request for clemency, a plea for an early parole, filed by Detective Miller just 6 months ago.
He stared at the document. The words swam before his eyes, each one a hammer blow against the crumbling walls of his certainty. A plea for clemency, forgiveness, a second chance. Filed just 6 months ago. While Leo was in his cell, sharpening the blade of his hatred for the final strike, Miller was out in the world, trying to set him free. Attached to the formal request was a personal letter from Miller to the governor. A letter that was never meant to be seen by anyone else. A letter that was now the last will and testament of a man's foolish, stubborn hope. Leo's hands trembled as he read it. To the Honorable Governor, it began, I am writing that as a police officer, but as a citizen who believes in the possibility of redemption. 20 years ago, I arrested a young man named Leo. He was full of a rage that I recognized because I have seen it in the eyes of so many young men who were failed by the world long before they failed it themselves. We, the state, did our duty. We caged the monster. But I have always wondered if we failed to see the man. I have followed his case for 2 decades. I have seen the glimmers of something more than just a criminal. A fierce, protective instinct, a sharp mind, a survivor's will. These are the qualities that, in a different life, could have made a great man. Instead, they made a great inmate. He has paid his debt to society. Another decade in that place will serve no purpose but to extinguish the last spark of the man he could still become. I am asking you to grant him clemency, to give him the second chance that I, and the system I represent, failed to give him as a boy. I am not asking you to forgive his crimes. I am asking you to invest in his future. The letter ended with a single handwritten line that was not part of the official plea. A personal note added at the bottom. Everyone deserves someone to believe in them. I believe in him. Leo dropped the letter as if it had burned his hands. He leaned back against the cold concrete wall of his cell, the world spinning, a silent scream building in his chest. The truth was not a revelation. It was an execution.
The man he had murdered, the object of his life's defining hatred, wasn't his jailer. He was his only ally. The one person on a planet of billions who had looked at the sum of his worthless, violent life and had stubbornly, inexplicably seen potential. Miller hadn't pitied him. He had believed in him. And Leo had killed him for it. The irony was so cruel, so absolute, it was almost a physical force. It crushed the air from his lungs. He had spent 20 years nurturing a hatred for a man that didn't exist, all while the real man was quietly, thanklessly fighting for his salvation. He had walked out of prison to destroy his one and only hope. He looked around the small gray cell, his new home, his tomb. This was it, the end of the story. Miller had tried to write him a different ending, a story of redemption, of a second chance. But Leo, in his blind, stupid rage, had ripped that page out and burned it. And he had written his own ending, a tragedy. One where the villain doesn't just lose. He realizes in his final moments of clarity that he was the villain all along. A single hot tear, the first in over 20 years, traced a path down his cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a tear of pure, agonizing understanding. He had finally gotten his victory. He had won. He had defeated the one man who thought he was worth saving. And now, for the rest of his life, he would have to live with it. Alone. In the echoing silence of his perfect, empty triumph.